heritage based upon a system of concepts. And the system of concepts that we have centers around architectural preservation, so saving great buildings. But then we sort of realized that, so these great buildings in the Vancouver context, they're usually grand and picturesque. They're built prior to 1940, and at some point we realized that there are great buildings after 1940. So there's this concept that came up, which is the recent landmarks. So Ericsson's 1980 Evergreen Building on West Pender, that is a recent landmark. So is the Vancouver Public Library, the former main branch on Burrard and Robson, which is now Victoria's Secret, I believe. So our system is mainly set up to recognize architecture and historic significance. Other reasons for importance don't generally fit into that system. But Joy Kogawa House is an interesting example of something that was valued for other reasons. So the house itself is rather ordinary. And yes, it was built in 1912, and yes, it was a historic event that the Canadian government interned Japanese Canadians and confiscated the house. However, I would argue that the significance of Joy Kogawa House is more social. The association with the author, and also for its contemporary use as a place of healing and reconciliation, and also as a symbol of racial discrimination. So I'd like to note that while that part of the Japanese Canadian history has been made part of heritage, that heritage, something lacking that has been pointed out by Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people recently is that the historic context with which we use to make heritage has not sufficiently included the stories of First Nations. And I think that might come up later tonight, and if that doesn't, it would definitely come up November 28th, the final panel for the year. So more recently, Chinatown has become a significant heritage topic. And Chinatown is really a place that sort of defies our current heritage system. The system as it is hasn't been able to handle the forms of heritage that people are identifying as important in Chinatown. And people there are demanding that it be looked at in a way that is people-centered, that there's life there, and the heritage of China is greater than the sum of the heritage buildings. And so this concept of intangible heritage has started to come into prominence, although it's not really accounted for in the system in terms of how we deal with it. It's a concept that's confusing to a lot of people. In the context of the way that intangible heritage is being used as a word in local discussions, I take intangible heritage to be a catch-all term. That means the things that architectural preservation does not or has not intended to cultivate, protect, or recognize. So in Chinatown, we have these scenarios where people argue, if you put dragons on the buildings and use red paint, you put a balcony on it, that meets the heritage requirements. There's a scenario with 105 Kiefer, which is something very important that we need to grasp. And if you're familiar with 105 Kiefer, 105 Kiefer is on Kiefer in Columbia. It's currently an empty lot. It's the one that was, its rezoning was rejected by City Council. And its application as outright development was also rejected by the city. So that empty lot is a very important heritage issue, I would argue. So the heritage and the planning system couldn't deal with 105 Kiefer. So the developer and a number of supporters of that development on that site argued that there's no heritage building there. There's no demolition of a heritage building there. Therefore, there's no heritage issue. And that got some pretty good traction. So the association in people's minds of heritage as being only about saving great buildings, and therefore it's equated with this idea of no change, that really sort of overpowers the nuance of places. And in fact, 105 Kiefer is actually an extremely critical heritage issue, because the heritage issue is that whatever the new building is going in, it needs to contribute to what makes Chinatown Chinatown. So for these problems, the heritage discipline has this concept of a landscape. And there are different definitions, though they are generally quite related. The ones that I'm referring to, the definitions for landscapes that I'm referring to, focus on the holistic relationship between the experiential aspects of a place with the physical aspects of a place. Earlier this year, the Architecture Conservancy of Ontario held a symposium on Main Street. It was quite interdisciplinary. In addition to the building form and existing buildings, there was a big focus on thinking about the heritage of a small, local, independent business. And they also focused on live work, individual ownership patterns as heritage, and how a good Main Street supports city life. And so this is the Architecture Conservation of Ontario, and they're talking about these things that go beyond really sort of what's built. They had planners that were talking about planning studies for Kensington Market. And they're questioning this observation of whether there's something inherent in Kensington Market that makes a resident help a passerby carry 24 baguettes. So, these were sort of very prominent architects. Someone like, if you follow heritage nationally, someone like Catherine Naismith is talking about this. So she specializes in heritage and history. So this sort of concept is not widely practiced or known or accepted here. And although I think like some Chinatown people are here, the planning team, some members of the planning team are here, I think they're starting to look at or think of Chinatown as a landscape. It's really not that prominent. We've been, I guess, talking to some people from Punjabi Market and think of it as a landscape. Just to close, finally, I think that Indigenous landscapes are very informative for our urban environment. But these are concepts that are very distant from where we are now. I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but Asinaipi, the English is writing on stone in Alberta. This is the most recent Canadian UNESCO World Heritage Site. And this is what is known as an associative landscape. UNESCO has 3 types. This is the associative landscape. The associative landscape is usually a natural landscape. There aren't any buildings really on it. There's not much that's physical on it. But the really important thing about an associative landscape is that the meaning of the landscape is not visible. You have to experience it to understand the meaning. And I think that has, I'm not the one that thinks this, but there are a lot of lessons that we can learn for our urban environment here. How people interact with these features in a natural environment sustains the culture. And I think that to us in an urban environment, that's a pretty intuitive idea. It's only when we start using the words intangible heritage or landscape where it makes it difficult. So these are these trends towards new concepts in heritage or newer concepts in heritage. So tonight I kind of want to talk about where we are in heritage in the city and how different people in different areas feel about this change. And maybe because there's, with all change, those involved have very different reactions to change. And there are most likely different points of view in the room. And we'd like to use this talk as a way to help people understand what is happening, why it's happening. And if we share a commonality of wanting to use heritage to better our city and society, then how we with different views about heritage can work more closely together, I hope we can work that out, or start working that out tonight. So with that, I just want to introduce our 4 panelists. So first, we have Angie Bain. I'm not going to read their bio, it's in the PDF that we forwarded over to you. I think there's a link. There's a link there if you want to download it. Angie is a researcher of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and she's a director of Heritage BC. Paul Brevitt, he's the executive director of Heritage BC. I think last year he did a series of roundtables across BC, and he compiled a report called State of Heritage. Anisha Grilo, sorry if I mispronounced that. She's vice chair of the Punjabi Market Regeneration Collective, and there's some work being done there, and so she's quite active volunteering time with that. And we have Robert Lemon. I think most of you know Robert Lemon. He's quite famous local heritage expert and architect. He's been involved in heritage for a long time. So I just want to start with Paul. I think Paul, because you did the report, can you kind of succinctly tell us what you did and some of the, what is the state of heritage in relation to us?
Good question. What is the state? So very briefly, Heritage BC was contracted by the province to go around the province and hold meetings to understand what is the practice and interpretation of heritage, or the interpretation of the practice, I suppose. And we asked people questions such as defining heritage. How do they define it? How do they collaborate? What is the vision and values future of heritage? How do they see the practice evolving? How is it related to the environment and economy? All of these topics are related to the province's strategic priorities for heritage. And so what we were essentially doing was testing the province's priorities and seeing how is it actually happening throughout the province. We had 26 meetings and talked with 500 people. We came up with 12 recommendations, and those are supported by quite a number of actions. That has been given to the province. It's on our website. If anyone gets our newsletter, there'll be a link in the newsletter tomorrow when it goes out tomorrow morning. May I just say a few things? So Bill had asked me, could I say a few comments about what happened in the Vancouver meeting? We had about 20 people at that meeting, and so I picked out a few. I went through our notes and picked out a few comments that I thought might be of interest for today's conversation. So defining heritage, people talked about it as being fluid and not static, that it changes over time, it's multi-layered, multi-dimensional. And Bill at the beginning said, we build heritage. What we actually learned is we do heritage. We heard this in Vancouver, but we heard it throughout the province as well. And many people refer to the word heritage as being a word of action, not a static state. So related to that, language is heritage, culture is heritage, land is heritage. How we view it is complex and deep, and the foundation of heritage is impacted and changed. You communicate heritage, you don't edit it. You just communicate it constantly. You are stewards who convey heritage. It is alive. It will be remolded. You have a duty to care to communicate it. So that was an individual who said all of that. And we did our best to record what people said so that we really got the essence of what they said and not leave it for us to interpret what people said. So there were a couple of very good points in there. One that does come up that we heard everywhere we went is it's about storytelling. So I'll just quickly jump to another point. It was very rare that anyone talked about the built environment. It was so rare that you could almost count on one hand, and I'm not exaggerating. People really felt it was about storytelling. A building might represent heritage, but what also is important is who built it, why did they build it, who occupies it, what business was there, so on and so forth. Around language in the Vancouver meeting was a little more, or people talked about the language of heritage and had more difficulty with it. And they said conservation and heritage are problematic. The words conservation and heritage are problematic, and they come with baggage. The language of the sector is not the language of the general public. The word heritage can be an obstacle to get to and engage the right people. The word has a history, connotations, and associations, and so on and so forth. It's a negative word. Some people in the province advocated that we just get rid of the word heritage altogether because of the, as this person says, the baggage that's associated with it. And the word conservation is another problematic word because it has a very, for a lot of people, you evoke something in particular, and for some people it doesn't have that same meaning. So it can have a form of segregation in that way. I mentioned built heritage, so I'm just going to skip over that. One of the interesting points, the province has a priority that says heritage will come together to identify the province. That's not quoting the priority, but basically it all comes together to create an identity for the province. And we heard that that's absolutely wrong. That identity is local, and that's the priority. And in fact, the legislation is set up that way, that it's about local priorities when it comes to interpreting signifying heritage.
Can I just interrupt?
Yeah.
Sorry. So I just want to give other people a chance to kind of, no, it's great that you're bringing this up. But Anisha, so you're listening to this, and I was wondering if you can talk about how you got sort of how I chose you, and because of the Punjabi market motion, and basically when you went to City Council, can you just talk about the motion a little bit, and then when you went to City Council, you said something to Council about their heritage rules and how that does or does not apply. Can you just talk about that?
So the motion that we passed as a collective regarded the Punjabi market in Vancouver. It's a 3-block commercial district celebrating its 50th anniversary next year. That has been in recent years in a very fast and large decline. And basically, when I started this project, I didn't understand what I would be dealing with in terms of the colonized institutions that we were basically having to beg for a little bit of crumbs in terms of acknowledging and valuing our racial heritage. Furthermore, for example, on the Heritage Management Plan website, part of the City of Vancouver website, it's quoted that the City Council recognizes the tremendous value in Vancouver's historically and culturally significant buildings, monuments, and other sites, and because of this, Council oversees a comprehensive heritage management program to protect, restore, and rehabilitate as many sites as possible. Great, but the problem is the way heritage on these lands is defined and the way it is valued. So what this brings me to, what my problem is BC is on unceded territories. Why are we asking the city, why are they the point of action in terms of granting us any recognition? Why do we have to fight and go through these processes to get a little bit of what they deem historic value? It's all basically structured in a very purposeful way, and I think that purposeful way is to perpetuate the settler colony. So by justifying white history, European history on these lands, and centering it, it also within that justifies the genocide of Indigenous peoples that have occurred on Turtle Island.
But for
about-
you, for
me.
the Punjabi market community, how did you feel?
So after the motion passed, we were all really emotional. We were all crying. I didn't know why I was crying. And when I thought about what I was crying for, it was nothing in terms of being allowed to, in terms of a larger power acknowledging my racial identity on these lands. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Robert, how do you feel when you listen to Paul's reporting on definitions and what Anisha said?
Well, I guess because I'm the, so, as the architect and is that working? Does that work? So my bias clearly is architecture, historic preservation. I have a degree in historic conservation, and I worked for 40 years in the city of Vancouver, always on building projects and many planning projects too. So, and I did work for the city of Vancouver for a number of years. I was involved in the initiatives in Chinatown, but back in the mid-90s, there was a rezoning of Chinatown and Gastown subsequently. So I'm somewhat familiar with the layering of issues that are both cultural as well as architectural. I guess the question for you, though, is what were you asking the city for? I don't understand what you were asking the city for and why you were denied.
So we were asking for funds and resources to be allocated to revitalize the area because it is historically and culturally significant. South Asian folks were first entered these lands or came onto these lands in the late 1800s. So we have a long history, just almost as long as European history, which is centered. So that's kind of why. And also, I don't know if I said this, but it was the first and largest market, South Asian market outside of South Asia. And basically what the motion passing meant that the council affirmed, again, the historical significance of the area, and also that the mayor determined May 31st, 2020, Punjabi Market Day, because it's the 50th anniversary for when the first shop opened. Also to formally direct staff to consult, which I have another very big issues with consultations, and yeah.
Well, I guess it comes down to the question of money then, and that's always the critical thing in any discussion with historic preservation. When the core cultural issues as well, money is necessary to make them happen. What the city, the only commodity the city has other than cash is to deal with density. So and the burden of historic preservation in Canada, again, I'm speaking from my perspective as an architect, is that the wish for a national program of historic preservation through the Historic Places Initiative, the Canadian Register of Historic Places, the standards and guidelines, those are all very admirable tools, but they don't actually pay for the cost of restoring the building. The governments, senior governments, are not very good at that. We'll talk about tax incentives a little bit later. But when it comes down to preserving buildings, the only thing the city has is regulations and density, usually. So the quandary, I'm not at all trying to defend or represent the city's position, but they have trouble dealing with anything that involves giving money to a group of people. And that, I think, could be the problem that you have.
Why does the city have this type of power on unceded lands? I think that's where the conversation should start being produced in. And I think people might think that's a huge task, but it's really, if we don't do it now, we're going to go another 30, 50 years, and we're going to probably be seeing environmental degradation by then.
So I want to get Angie in, and you're listening to this, and so talking about how funds are funds are obviously limited, and I guess if you can tell us how you feel about how funds are being distributed. Is Indigenous Heritage receiving any resources, or are your communities having to do work themselves without being resourced?
Thanks. I think that it's an interesting issue, and it's not unique to Vancouver. and it's not unique to the province, and it's not unique to Canada, right? If we look at internationally, the discussions around heritage for Indigenous peoples, we are dealing with this issue all over the world. So I was invited here today because I was one of the co-authors of a paper recently released on Indigenous cultural heritage. So I worked with Karen Aird from First Peoples Cultural Center and Dr. Gretchen Fox, who's an anthropologist based in Kamloops. And we've worked together on projects over the years. And so we took the approach that from what we've been hearing from communities that we've been working with, nothing about us without us, right? And this is the problem that we've seen, is there's communities that have tremendous need and desire to work on heritage issues. But we're finding money in the most unusual kind of places. So something that the city might consider a heritage value, we might get funding through language programs, because that's where the money is right now. In fact, that's what First Peoples was focusing on for the longest time. Their mandate is larger than that. It does include cultural heritage, but they've never had the resources to support communities who want to do heritage work. So they became known as the place to go for language money. And so communities have had to get pretty creative about where to get money, I think just as much as any other organization that wants to deal with heritage issues. The simple fact is there's just no money in heritage. You know, we're recovering from the years where we had a federal government that didn't value heritage in the same way that communities value it. And so we've seen changes at the national level that trickled down into the province and into communities and into cities. And I think we in the last few years, we've really been recovering from that. But you're right, it is very much about money. Because money, when you put money behind something, you're saying that's a priority. That's worth us investing in. When we have all of these competing interests, what do we decide to put our money behind? And that's the concern for Indigenous communities.
So Robert, what are your thoughts on that? Because you know, there's Built Heritage receives money. Not much, but like if there's all these other interests and different ways of thinking about heritage, should that be divvied up in a different way?
No, I think the general discussion is that if heritage in its broadest sense was deemed to be a priority by politicians at all levels, then you would see money flowing. There's no reason why Canada can't have a system like the United States has had since the Nixon administration, where money comes to help people preserve historic buildings. Canada has never done that. So if the politicians could do it, but I don't think they see it as a priority. So I think that every time there's an election, I tell everybody to write your MP or write whoever's running for politics and ask them what they're doing to support federal, provincial, and municipal granting program, and for all aspects of heritage. So the squeaky hinge gets the noise, and if it was considered a priority, and I think the problem now that heritage has slipped in the 40 years that I've been here, heritage has slipped from being a priority. Certainly at the municipal level, other things are a higher priority now. Sustainability, homelessness, there are other issues that the city has to grapple. Heritage is way, way, way down the list. And it shouldn't be there, because heritage can be part of solutions to those other problems. Sustainability, homelessness. Bill de Blasio in New York, his policy for solving homelessness is prioritizing reusing existing buildings rather than building new ones. We should have a policy like that. When I was in the city, senior heritage planner, again a planner, not an architect, every year there was a capital plan. Put a policy in place for the city to first consider reusing existing resource before you build a new one. And that was 20 years ago, and nothing has changed since then. So it's very frustrating, but it needs to be a constant message that heritage is more than just a diversity of people's different opinions about what we think is heritage. There's a lot of common ground, and I think the emphasis should be on finding the common ground for the benefit of many different aspects of cultural heritage.
Paul, did you
Yes, I feel heritage is very much in transition, and we're moving from points of what some people will call the old school attitudes of the built environment, the Eurocentric built environment, to other ideas around heritage. Personally, I feel strongly it's not one against another, but it's an evolution to understand what are all the different elements that are important to us as a society, and how do we work together. It's not, let's get rid of one so that another can come in. It's not, let's divvy up the money even finer than it already is, because it is true, there is not a lot of money. We run the only grant program in the province for heritage, and I can tell you, there's not a lot of money when you consider it's for the entire province. I read
other than the Vancouver Heritage Foundation.
Well, but they run it for the city. We run it for the province. I read something recently that said arts is a, this is a fellow, he has had a life in arts, and now is a politician in the States, he's a governor, senator or something. Art is still perceived as a luxury for the privileged, not a necessity at all. Cultural organizations need to recalibrate efforts and partner with local, regional, national agencies of health, human source services, education, agriculture, housing authorities, prisons, national parks, veterans affairs, and environment in order to develop team strategies. And I read that and I thought that's where heritage needs to go, is it needs to develop. It's not just heritage for the sake of heritage, but heritage for community and society, and find the points that these elements can fit into this conversation.
So in the back we were talking about tax credits. And several years ago there was an initiative to try to get federal tax credits for the rehabilitation of historic buildings. And that initiative failed. So my question, Robert, can you tell us why that failed?
Well, it failed because it wasn't developed in the proper way in the first place. The Federal Historic Places Initiative in Canada, which was from 2001, I sat on one of the working parties that dealt with the creation of the Standards and Guidelines, which is an admirable document. I've been involved in Standards and Guidelines for the City of Vancouver, for the province of British Columbia, and then at the federal level. But it's modeled on the American system, which I mentioned, came from the Nixon administration of all things in like 1968. They wanted to give tax credits for people to invest in restoring historic buildings, 25% income tax credit. To do that, so the tax credits came first. Then they figured out we have to have a way to identify which heritage buildings. So they created the National Register of Historic Places. And then we figured, okay, we've got these national buildings listed. How are we going to control and make sure the conservation work, again, material conservation work, is done properly? So they created the Secretary of Interior Standards for Conservation, which our standards are largely based on. Unfortunately, what we have the Register, the Canadian Register of Historic Places. We have the Standards and Guidelines, which are used on a voluntary basis. They're not mandatory. The incentives over the third prong of that Historic Places Initiative got off the ground in the wrong way by not being a tax program, but by being a grant. And I think there was something like $20 million over 2 years for the entire country, which meant like $1 million a province for a building a year, which is absolutely ridiculous and guaranteed to fail. So they've never actually implemented a proper income tax credit for investment in historic buildings. There's no reason why that couldn't be redone now and broadened to include other aspects of cultural heritage.
So these tax credits are for the rehabilitation of historic buildings.
Right.
We were talking in the back that 2 years ago there was a federal committee where a number of people were interviewed about the heritage programs in Canada. Two of those people, one person was Chris Reed from the National Trust, and he talked about tax credits. Julian Smith also talked about heritage tax credits. There were two Indigenous people there. One was worked with Angie Carnaird on the report, and the other one was is Madeline Redford, who's the mayor of Epaulet. And they were asked us, and they were saying that we don't know how tax credits apply to us. So how do we get someone like Angie or Anisha to care about tax credits? I think we can, but Angie, do you care about the tax credits?
Yeah, I do. And I think that for the very reasons that we were talking about, there are intersections in Indigenous interests with mainstream interests around heritage. And resourcing these intersections through innovative ways like tax credits, I think is a good thing. Because as we said, there's just not enough money. And that's one way of finding some money for something like that. And built heritage, we're talking, you're talking millions, right? Whereas a community, if you hear that, you're like, wow, what could I do with that much money? But really, the cost of the work of dealing with built heritage is really high. And so we've got to consider, for me, it's not so much about that I don't support tax credits. It's more about me wanting us to find other innovative ways to support other forms of heritage. And so let's not just focus all of our energy on one way or a couple of ways that benefit one type of heritage. How else can we find innovation to resource all of these other kinds of heritage priorities that we're identifying?
For me, I think I haven't thought a lot about tax credits and what they could mean for, especially Punjabi market revitalization, but obviously it would help because of money and what money gives access to. However, what I'm sort of fixated on is the definition of heritage. So definition always kind of insinuates a sense of ownership. And when we think of ownership, and then that the city is deeming certain points of ownership as valuable, when you look at the register, I suggest that you do. All the houses and places that are considered valuable enough for the city to deem it has heritage are rooted in white colonial histories. And also, I don't know if you've heard of Heritage Minutes. There's 93 of them. I watched all of them last night. And I would really, I would suggest you watch them and see the story that it's painting of what heritage is valued on this land. And quite frankly, even funding these heritage movements that are not Indigenous heritage, because Indigenous heritage is the only one that matters on these lands, I think, or should be funded right now. On my point. If we're allocating so much money to preserve and continue to preserve these sites, there's Indigenous communities all over Canada without clean drinking water and people arguing about where we're going to find money for that. Like, give me a break.
So Paul and Robert, do you have any thoughts on sort of broadening the what's recognized as heritage on a register, for example?
Okay. I feel like that's almost a trick question. The register is found in the legislation, and so that is very much rooted in the built environment. It's not going to help a lot of this conversation as it's defined, and it goes back to real property, which is a legal term that's fairly hard to understand. And it can be, Bill was talking about intangible heritage at the beginning, and that would be a very problematic concept when it comes to real property. I can say for myself personally, I think these things need to change. I think there are people who would like to see it change, but the mechanisms aren't there to allow it to change. Governments, municipalities, local governments are going to, maybe even for obvious reasons, tend to stick with legislation. They need to protect themselves, and if they've been given the legal right to do A but not B, they're not likely to do B. They will either do A or nothing at all. and that tends to be what we see in this case.
And I think the question is that the registry shouldn't be the one thing where everything to do with heritage in this country, culturally or otherwise, is placed or listed. It's one tool, and it does deal with property, because you can have a legal address, you can have a status on a piece of property. It's hard to have a connection to an intangible quality. So the register does do that, and it could continue to do that, but there are likely other tools that can recognize other aspects of our heritage. There's commemorative pieces, there are commemorative statements, there are cultural initiatives that could broaden and recognize other aspects of our cultural heritage.
I'll just quickly mention, Bill, I had a question from local government in North Central BC that has a fairly good heritage program that's based on the legislation. And the planner had asked, they wanted to recognize some individuals. She didn't explain who these people are and why. That's have no bearing for me. She sent the email to the government, the main contact in the government related to this issue, and copied it to me. The government, of course, gave the very, the line, as it should. And I wrote to the individual and said, find a way to do it. If you can't do it through the sort of legal mechanism, but you could find another method to do this and accomplish what you want to do. If this is important to your community, then it's important enough to do it. But you just have to find another way to do it.
Isn't that what citations and Orders of BC, Orders of Canada, and City of Vancouver Heritage Advocacy Awards are for? Awards or recognition?
It could certainly be that. They were looking at it through the official lens, the register. That's how they wanted to look at it. It was through their Heritage Commission, and so they're in charge of the register in this case. So they were looking at how do we take the heritage tools that have been handed to us through the Local Government Act, but still recognize this element that is not real property.
So, Robert, I wanted to ask you about this. I mean, you've been in this for a while, about the evolution of heritage. And so this broadening is sometimes problematic. So, now we have these best practices, like UNESCO has this framework called Historic Urban Landscapes, and it's really broad, right? And it's architecture preservation, the parameters are much less broad, it's much more controlled. Now you have these wide frameworks that try to deal with climate change impacts, participatory planning, integration into city planning, partnerships of stakeholders, focus on nature, focus on social and cultural practices, values, economic processes, intangible dimensions. It's very, very wide. And so I just want to know what you thought about this evolution. When we try to broaden something so much, is there a danger of kind of losing focus and preventing us from focusing on anything properly at all?
Well, it is a very long and comprehensive list of objectives. I don't think it's that new, though. I'm looking at a few people in this room that I've worked with on conservation plans for Fort Steele, or the people maybe remember in 1980 the Klein Commission for saving the Roundhouse at Expo 86 before most of it was demolished, and Robson Square and the Fairmont Academy. I've been involved in their essentially planning initiatives, and in those planning initiatives, it's not just on the building, it's on the ensemble. It used to be called cultural landscapes, and now I guess the current term is historic urban landscape. But they're never, a building or a site is never in isolation. It's always related to something else. And I think that is a new expanded definition of what the sustainability measures, the geological measures. I remember on most projects that we work with the team, landscape architects, geologists, civil engineers, that look at all the aspects of the property or the site that is in addition to the layering of cultural and vegetable heritage. I remember working on Riverside, an early scheme for Riverside in Coquitlam, where the arboretum, the history of the medical facilities there, as well as the historic gardening history, all those things were layered on not just the buildings but the site. Robson Square worked on that a number of times and did the SOS for Robson Square. It's a whole number of interweaving values to do with building, material, landscape context. My master's thesis was on modernism and context because as a city planner, the challenge was how do you deal with an addition or a new building in a historic context? And so we're always looking at that realm, or what we now call historic urban landscape. So I think the scope of it has expanded to include other environmental and sustainability measures, but the general idea has been there for some time.
So the three of you, in your context, do you feel this is happening?
Yeah, I do, and I think it's necessary. I think that that the diversity of heritage needs to be recognized and appreciated. And so I don't think we need to fear that there's just too much and we're going to lose focus and there's only so much money to go around, and so let's just focus on this. I don't think that creates space for those aspects of our heritage that maybe people in your community don't know. Maybe they don't know the history of the building, the fact that places like in New Westminster, people from my community in the interior of British Columbia went there for prison. And we lost people and people were buried there. And so that place, so very far from my home community, has ties to my community. And I think that what you're talking about in the layers of places and buildings, there's so much there that we have to consider. And these things aren't new, like you say. Our indigenous traditional knowledge, they thought about things like climate change. We just didn't call it climate change, right? There are people who have this intimate connection to their heritage, who people in my community, when they're out on the land, they're the ones who know when something's not right, because they have that connection. And that's the very same thing you see in communities with heritage.
So can I ask you about 312 Main then? So 312 Main is the former police station on Main Street in Powell? Cordova. And so that is it's a B-listed heritage building. It's by Townley Matheson, who designed the City Hall. But are you interested in this building? You're in this building.
Yeah, so I work with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and one of my colleagues is here in the office, or here in the audience today. And so for many years, we had offices in the Gastown area just because that's where we ended up. So we had no real connection to Gastown, but that's where we ended up in buildings there. And we outgrew our space and it got quite expensive, and so we needed to find other space. And we looked all around the city, and one of the places that really caught our attention early on was 312 Main, because the building itself, when we first started looking at it, was just a shell. So that's the former police station, for those who don't know. And it's an interesting choice for our organization, because that's where, if you're familiar with some of the issues that UBCIC has been involved in, that's where Frank Paul was incarcerated. And that's one of the issues that our organization dealt with on behalf of the family and community. And also, just the fact that it was a former police station and all of the connotations that a building like that had. So for us, it was an interesting choice of place to move to after we had made ourselves at home in Gastown, and it felt like home for us. And our community members loved to come in. Anytime people were in town, they would drop in and come into the building. So we had to select something that felt like home to us. And we liked the idea of 312 Main. When we first moved in, they had envisioned a place to bring nonprofits together. So organizations like UBCIC would come into that building. We would reclaim the space and we would give it a new life. And that's what we're talking about, what the buildings can do. You can change the feel of buildings. When we first talked about it, there was potential. There was a lot of potential because we were the first tenants in 2 years ago, Christina, coming on. We were the first tenants in the building, and for the longest time, we were the only tenants in the building. And we were up on the 4th floor, and the building was empty, and there was construction going on all around us, and we were waiting for all of these other people to come in. And we had all these interim measures, so we had security at the front. And it wasn't even the front door, it was the side door right next to a bus stop, so nobody could park there, and you had to drop your elders off, and they had to get in before the bus came. So it wasn't the most inviting way for people to come into our building. And that hasn't changed yet. So we have some issues going forward because what we had envisioned is not what happened in the end. Our office is very comfortable where we are, but it has created a few issues for our member communities who maybe not are comfortable coming into the city that often, and we wanted them to feel like UBCIC was home for them, and we haven't quite seen that yet. And just a half floor above us are the old jail cells, and they have done nothing with them yet. So it's very uncomfortable for some of our community members to know that that's there. But before we moved in, we asked permission from all of the local communities, the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh. We had the building smudged over 4 or 5 times before we moved in and many times since. And we discussed it with one of our most important, I guess, groups of people that we work with on the downtown east side who had a different vision for that building. So we were aware going in that we were potentially taking up space that this community could have used themselves and had a very desperate need for, right? So it wasn't an easy decision, but it's an interesting one for us.
Thank you. I think it's almost time for us to go to questions. Before we do that, this came up, I think someone might actually ask about this, so I'm going to ask it. But it came up in the back, and I want to kind of wrap this question around commonalities and how do we work together and ideas of working together. So if you're not familiar, there's this building called the Fairmont Building. It's on 33rd off of Cambie. It's an A-listed building, and I think it's a couple of years now. The building that this piece of land is on is owned by the Musqueam Squamish Tsleil-Waututh Development Corporation, along with Canada Lands Corporation. And a few years ago, the MSD Development Corporation requested that this building be removed from the site as a sign of reconciliation, largely because it used to be the RCMP headquarters. And so City Council decided to have this building removed, and now there's, I guess, a search to relocate this building. If this building is not relocated, then it will be demolished. So we were talking in the back earlier. There's different heritage interests here. Does anyone have any ideas on how we go about understanding what's happening here and how we discuss these things and what might a process be? Paul, do you want to start us off?
If I knew the answer to that, I have no idea. I was just trying to find, we have this building on our, what we call the watch list. And our point of view for the watch list, which was launched about a year ago, I believe, was more to raise issues raise awareness around issues. Not to say that this building is threatened to be demolished. We don't get too concerned about that. I know we should, but we're looking more at some other issues. And I was trying to find this particular reference because we actually quote Bill in saying this, but the basic premise is we need, and so I'm just punting it back in a way, we need to find ways to come together to talk about these things. And because that particular site has a number of challenges with it. And Angie is, in some ways I think Angie's maybe answered the question or given a very good answer. That there are ways to do this, and there are ways to approach these very troubled buildings. It doesn't necessarily have to end in demolition, but I don't think that necessarily means the conversation is easy. It can be highly challenged. So that was just our point of putting it forward, was we need to find these ways to come together and talk about it. It might still end up being demolished, but our point was it's the process that we need to understand.
Robert, I know you have something to say.
Well, I've got lots to say.
I was in Hong Kong a year and a half ago to see the new Herzog and de Meuron were taking over an entire block in Central, which is the old Victoria Police Station. And there are probably a dozen buildings. Trevor, you might know the history, maybe I think you've been there. Fascinating assemblage of buildings from the colonial rule period that were not being demolished. They were being repurposed. They were being reused for community and cultural uses, an art gallery, a theater. You talk about the jail cells. The jail cells are actually the changing rooms for the theater. So they actually kept an entire wing of this horrible penitentiary, but repurposed it for a very modern use, and it's just remarkable that it happened at all. Why can't the Fairmont Academy be looked at with the same open eyes? Because I think that there has not been a discussion that's inclusive discussion of all parties about what should happen to that building. I was involved for a number of years in the planning exercise on that property. The first thing we did with the team, like I mentioned before on other projects, with landscape architect, geologist, we plotted the original streams that went across the site. We plotted the original settlement patterns. There were actually no settlements on the site. There were paths and there were animal tracks known historically, and certainly vegetation. The geology, the underlying civil engineering aspects were all thoroughly investigated as part of an urban planning exercise for that site, which included retaining the building. Now, the building has a very varied history. It was first a school, a private boys' school, signed by McClure and Fox, 1912. It didn't last very long. Then it became a hospital after World War I. Then it became the headquarters and academy for the RCMP. So that's the sticking point, is the police era that occupied that building. And I think that's a very valid point to recognize in dealing with what should we do with this building. But the decision to get rid of it, I think, does not consider the benefits that that building could have for sustainability measures. Why tear down a building that's been around for over 100 years? Bricks have been the carbon input to create bricks, the timbers that are in that building, they have a value, and that building could be reused. In fact, I did a number of schemes for repurposing that building, including a reconciliation center for First Nations, but also it could also be looked at as just a building on the site that could be used for many different things with a proper or different newly built reconciliation commemoration on the site. None of that, I believe, was done thoroughly. City Council agreed to create a policy that simply said, we're going to get rid of the building. And I think that's a very short-sighted position to have reached, and I think it's one that should be questioned. There should be a questioning about why there was not broader community engagement about what to do with this building, and to involve all factors that involved in that. That's where it comes down to the argument that it's not just a heritage, nice old-looking building. It's a perfectly practical building that has a place in the planning of that site that could actually be an asset to the site and not a detriment.
I think this debate is quite easy to solve. And I think it is a perfect example of what heritage is valued. So this was a boys' school, this was a medical institution, this was the headquarters for the RCMP. The RCMP was created in order to police and facilitate the genocide of Indigenous peoples on these lands, to then implement, I don't have the right words, to then allow the settler colony to come in and become the normal steward, or the normalized stewards of the land. So I think that if we are real in our reconciliation efforts, and the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh peoples have said, this is not what we want this here, and we're not honoring that, that is going down a very, very wrong path.
There's no consensus in that across the country, and I think that we've heard examples
But it
where...
doesn't matter about across the country, sorry to interrupt you, it matters about the lands we're on and the people that are the owners of the land, which is the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh.
Okay, so I'm gonna step in here. I'm not really gonna stop this, but I'm not really interested in having a debate about it. I'm more interested in finding out what do we do to sort of move forward, and like how might we move forward, right? So I want to ask Angie the question. I think we're saying that there needs to be a discussion. Like, how do we have discussions and have a process around this? Do you have any advice?
Yeah, I think that, and this is a point I wanted to make tonight because I think it's pretty important when we talk about heritage in Vancouver. Because the city of Vancouver has done a remarkable job, I think, in the past couple of years especially, around reconciliation, right? We had people like Ginger Gosnell-Myers, who worked with the city to help define reconciliation. And they've done amazing work. The problem that I'm seeing, and I see it not just in the city of Vancouver, but all around, is how we silo these different disciplines in different fields. So we talk about reconciliation as one thing, but we don't see where it intersects with heritage. So these very things that people like Ginger are talking about when they talk about reconciliation, from an Indigenous perspective, it's all connected, right? So we shouldn't have to say, this applies to heritage, and this applies to this, and this applies to this, and this, and this. But because we don't say it that way, it's easier to treat these things as different entities, and they're not. They're not. They're connected. And I think that the city can build on the work that they've been doing around reconciliation. In the planning department, they've done quite a bit of work around that, and expand it into heritage. So the building blocks are there. What happened, what they did well when they did reconciliation was they did engagement well, they did consultation well. And it was meaningful, it involved communities, and it was about building relationships. And for me, any of this work is about relationships, because it's about people with competing values and ideas coming together and agreeing on what's important and what's worth our money and time.
So I'm just going to say one last thing and I'll open up to questions very quickly. I've told this story to a few of my board members. 2 years ago, I was at the national conference, and that was in Ottawa. I spoke to a person from the Ontario Heritage Trust about this predicament. And what they told me, because the topic of this was about sites of conscience. The topic of that session was about sites of conscience, and I went up and asked the Ontario Heritage Trust person and gave them the story. And basically, they're quite involved with Indigenous community members in Ontario. They own property, they manage property. They sometimes manage property together with Indigenous groups. And what they said to me basically was, you're not in a position to do anything because you don't have a relationship with the Indigenous people. It's only when this thing popped up that you're trying to have a conversation with them. You didn't try to have a conversation with them before it popped up. So I think this is kind of about the relationship building that you're speaking about. So I'm just going to end that there. If someone wants to comment, feel free to comment. If you have other questions, feel free to ask other questions. We have mics on two sides.
what I think is a kind of an organizational problem in the city that makes moving towards intangible heritage very, very difficult. And that's that the planning department, that the Heritage Commission is a part of in a way. I'm chair of the Heritage Commission. That the planning department deals with zoning and land and buildings. And then you have a cultural services department that is somewhere over there, and they deal with cultural issues. Then you have Park Board that deals with community centers, that does a lot of the cultural programming that's going on in the city. And one of the issues that we are finding with the kind of relevance of heritage at this time is that we are being presented increasingly with projects where we are asked to kind of sign off on commemoration rather than any kind of preservation or conservation. And so going beyond, I think, Robert's arguments about sustainability, about continuing to use buildings, that's been part of the heritage conversation for a long time. But this idea of rolling in cultural heritage when you have these two very, very separate silos within the city. One of them is physical planning, the other is cultural planning. As far as I can see, I cannot see any way of these groups coming together in a way that would make heritage more comprehensive from the city point of view. The city has only been involved in cultural programming beginning after the Second World War when it began to build community centers. Before that, the cultural things that were going on in the country were provincial or were federal. But in the kind of mandate creep that the city has been involved with for the last 20 or 25 years, it's gotten increasingly into this kind of cultural program. For the life of me, as a member of Heritage Commission, when I see these projects coming forward, I cannot think of anything that we can do other than stick up a plaque. This kind of commemoration thing. I don't see architects being interested in being coached. I don't see how cultural heritage can, or cultural history can be put into the design of new buildings. And so I just am asking you, how do you see this in the city coming together? Because basically what this comes down to is buildings and land and development, and we saw that today with the Squamish announcement about the land that they have there. It's buildings and land and development, and that is being morphed, I suppose, into saying this is really what cultural heritage is all about.
I think in many ways, Andrew's talked about this. We talk about heritage as a single entity, that it's something unto itself, distinct from everything else that is around it. It's not. It just, I'm talking with the Social Purpose Real Estate Collective. They look at heritage and other buildings with a very particular lens about social good, housing, not-for-profits, so on and so forth. And I personally think this is a very good thing. It's not well, it's heritage and therefore we save it, period. Yes, that's part of the equation to it. When we went around the province with these meetings, some people got a bit concerned that there was a tendency or an idea that let's just throw out the old concept and start new. No one agreed with that. It's not that we throw one out and bring in something new. It's that we evolve the conversation. And so I think this is where we need to go more, is the conversation has to evolve more, and we need to pull in other elements of what are the other kinds of values that are intrinsic with these buildings. And you heard Angie's story about the building that her company occupies and how that's been transformed. It could have gone a very different way. So I'm now going to start rambling, so I'll stop.
No, I'm just, Michael's point is a good one, and the idea of commemoration or recognition beyond plaques is the obvious thing, and there are other elements that can be built into the urban fabric, traces, the
original shoreline, traces of railway tracks that used to be. So those little things that you walk on and you experience can say, hey, there used to be something else here. And I think that part of the integrated approach to planning and this urban, what do we call it, historic urban landscape concept can incorporate those things in subtle ways, whether it's public art, whether it's I don't know, examples all over the world where you can hear things that are based on your movement. And they're possibly art things, and they could be changed too. They could have a program that changes this idea of recognizing some aspect of history. So how you get the silos together, I don't know. I've always wondered why we have a separate park board in the city of Vancouver. They seem to never agree with each other. It'd be certainly better if it was one organization. But the overlap of cultural and social history with planning, you're absolutely right, planning and as a regulatory thing. You can regulate, you can require. It's hard to require, but you can allow. That has its limitations on this expanded realm of heritage and looking at the commemoration side. So whether it's commemoration through an award or an event or a program rather than a tangible thing, I guess we're looking at intangible commemoration. And there's probably more brilliant people than me that can think of different ways to do that.
I think tonight was a good illustration of a conundrum that faces all of us involved in the heritage action of any sort. And that is, at one level, we wish to save people, languages, places, buildings because of their associations, which we value. But sometimes those associations are negative. Therefore, we don't value them. My mentor, a guy called George Baird in Toronto, wrote a very good essay about 999 Queen, which was the old Ontario mental asylum, which was a stunning example of 19th century Ontario architecture, but electroshock therapy happened there. And the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest came out, and the associations of the building became with electroshock therapy. So this is a tough one for us because we want to argue the positive associations of these, but we want to edit out the negatives. And I think it's a very, very tough issue. So I'm going to raise one. It's less a question than a call. The first element of the main campus designed by Erickson and Massey has just had a demolition order approved by the City of Burnaby. The Madge Hogarth Women's Residence at Simon Fraser is being, I think, quite foolishly done away with it to make way for a 6-story student residence. There's places nearby. Now, this is a really interesting case because the architecture is Erickson Massey brutalist. There's not, other than people under 30, there's not many fans of brutalism these days, but hipsters are. However, Madge Hogarth is an interesting case. She was a pioneering feminist. She put her money down so that women would have a residence at SFU from day one, a safe place and to be part of the community. So she put her family money down, and she got an honorary degree, etc. So the building has associations with the history of feminism. And probably, it's 11:57 right now. The Arthur Erickson Foundation is trying to save it, and there's going to be a final push in the next week or two. But here we have a building that, if it's saved, will probably be saved for its associations with feminism, and not for its architectural values. So these are very complex questions. And there isn't a constituency out there saying, yay, brutalism, or we need Arthur's original campus intact. This is the first concrete building to go, and it's a terrible precedent for the rest of the campus. So I guess it's less a question than an informational thing for everybody here. The building is complex for one more reason. Arthur had toured the Islamic world and privacy was going to be an issue for the women's residents at a largely male campus in a forest. Arthur had seen privacy screens in Rajasthan and other parts of Islamic world, lattices. So there's a cedar lattice version of that, something that can only happen in Canada. A cedar lattice version of an Islamic privacy screen on a brutalist concrete residence. And I think that in that is an amazing, pressure should be saved for that alone.
Thank you very much for this. I'm not a planner or an architect, and I'm not really sure I understand a lot of some of the things that were going on here. So Angie, this is actually a question for you. I'm going to make a fairy tale and say that I'm as rich as Bill Gates, for example, and I can see how I could give money to fix up a heritage building. I could understand what you would need to do for that, but I'm not really sure I can understand what you would mean by cultural heritage. So if I had money to give to your organization or others like your organization for cultural heritage, could you give me some idea of how you would use that?
Good question. I think, and I didn't read out the definition that we had of Indigenous cultural heritage that we put in that paper I talked about that we wrote, but it included so much more than the conventional understanding of heritage. So for my community and many indigenous communities, heritage is a living thing. It's not something, and I guess one of the poor ways of describing conventional heritage is we celebrate the old, right? The old buildings, the old stories, the old documents. For indigenous heritage, it's not that, because heritage is living. It's only strong because it's living, right? And the responsibilities that we have to our heritage are stewardship responsibilities. So as an Intlakatma person, I am Interior Salish, as an Intlakatma person, it is my responsibility to protect, celebrate, enhance, educate, pass on our heritage. That's a fact. You know, for me, it feels like I don't have a choice, because that's who I am. That's my connection to my area. So if I had that kind of money, there are very many ways that I would try to highlight, and I have to preface this by saying that I'm talking about Merritt, not Vancouver, right? So this is in the Nicola Valley, about 2.5 hours away from here. But it's a ranching town, and we celebrate the history of all of the local cattle farms that were there. And we celebrate things like the coal mines and the copper mine. And that side of history is known. But for my community, we have a small little display in our local museum. And anybody visiting the town of Merritt, that's what you would understand about the Intlakatma from Nicola Valley. That's it. So for me, I would put that money into all of the things that I see going on in my community and our neighboring communities. So we have language programs. We have kids who are relearning songs that our elders used to sing. Things that were recorded by ethnologists like James Tate back in 1900 when they were trying to preserve our culture, right? Things that you can find all over the world in museums and archives. They've got copies of the wax cylinder recordings that Tate did from our elders. And it took us a long time to find them again. But when people found them, they started to reuse them and relearn them. And they're using them. And we had kids who sing them in meetings. So it's something that's living. We're relearning place names. We are looking at the old right-of-ways from the abandoned Nicholas and Milkameen Railway, CPR, that went through the Nicola Valley. And we're working with the city to do an interpretive trail. So we're celebrating a shared history a shared heritage, but we're also including things. We're taking it as an opportunity to educate people on our ethnobotanical knowledge, the unique plants and medicines that we know about, right? And so there's a lot of things that you can do if you create space. And there's a lot of work going on in communities from the young to the old. And I think that really you just need opportunity. So with that money, I would show you. I would show you what heritage means to us, and you would not be disappointed.
Thank you so much, Angie. Your perspective is brilliant. One question I think in regards to heritage as an Indigenous person is, why is white colonial genocidal heritage prioritized over Indigenous heritage? When we talk about preserving a dorm at SFU, are we talking about how that mountain was a sacred ceremonial place? Are we talking about how the village that used to be in this territory used to be called Lecky? Are we talking about the very real lived experiences that my kin were murdered for? Are we talking about how our CMP officers were used to kidnap children to put into residential schools so folks could desecrate treaty rights? I'm just curious on how the preservation of a racist building is prioritized over host nations asking to take this building down. When they're asking to do that, there's elders consultated, there's ceremony involved. And why is that deprioritized over a provincial or a federal consensus?
So that's maybe directed at me. I don't see why you can't have both. I guess that's the point. I think that the site like Fairmont site can have both, and have a celebration of Indigenous history and recognition on that site in a way that is completely celebratory and current, at the same time as keeping a decent old building and using it for another purpose. The extension of getting rid of horrible things that have horrible pasts, it's such a complicated discussion to have. Germans have it dealing with the remembrance of the Holocaust. Did they tear down all the buildings that were related to the Holocaust? No, they're historic sites, so we remember the horrible things that happened. Did the American South get rid of all these slavery buildings related to slavery? No, because remember that slavery used to be a horrible thing. And do we get rid of all the paintings that the Catholic Church commissioned over the years because of the pedophilia that's rampant in the Catholic Church? Those are all related parallels that deal with how you deal with a building that has had a checkered history. And I think the argument that I put forward is that it does have a checkered history, it can be recognized, and it can also be put to a new use for another generation.
I think it's impossible to celebrate both without creating a position of power and position of inferiority. And in terms of all these sites that you've cited, I don't know if people who've been negatively affected by those things agree with those sites being commemorated, who they're being commemorated for. I think that's a very, again, repeating myself, a purposeful commemoration. And I don't know if I don't know if it's a kind of utopic white colonial fever dream to be able to say, hey, we are all la-di-da, this country so-called country has been through this and this, but we're all living harmoniously, when there are numerous statistics that show that it's just not the case.
Can I make a kind of a comment? So when we look at a building, say we wanted to preserve or conserve a historic building that might have been a residence. From my perspective, how is that more valuable in terms of heritage value than something like Charlie Lake Caves, which Christina and I had the privilege of going to see? And if you don't know Charlie Lake Cave, it's one of the oldest habitation sites known, 12,500 years going back. the local First Nations, this is up in northern BC, so the local First Nations, West Moberly, Doig, Prophet River, had to work for many years to raise the money to protect, to buy the land, basically, to protect this site, right? How is this, even though it's a cave with a long, long history of use as a shelter, as a lookout, as a place where people hunted, as a place where people gathered, how is that more worthy of our attention than another type of habitation, historic building, right? So from the Indigenous perspective, I think that's the kind of question that I've heard communities asking is, for us, heritage is so much bigger than just what we see in the city around us. It's something that we have a long-standing, multi-generational connection to. So why did those communities have to be the ones to say this is important? And incidentally, it's now registered as a heritage site. Is that correct? Yeah. Christina's a former archaeologist, so she knows better than me.
Sitting here listening to a conversation. I'm an architect and I live in a part of town that's going to undergo significant change over the next number of years, Falls Creek South. And as an architect, listening to the conversation and the words that you used, Angie, relationships and stories, have resonance with me as a designer, because I need to design from something. And that those stories are the matrix that you draw from when you're doing stuff. And the richer it is, the better it is. It's more interesting. Like merit as a one-dimensional thing that reflects one thing is not that interesting. But when you start to draw out the pieces that are forgotten, neglected, buried, killed, whatever, you lose those and then the stories are lost and you don't have that matrix to draw from to design meaningful things. So, Mrs. Gates here, I would spend the money on gathering in a place where you're starting to design something, or you're getting at the redesign of something, or the supplement, or looking at something in a different way. I put my money into the gathering stories and developing the relationships, which would give you then the wide breadth of understanding to design from. And it could be very difficult. I completely acknowledge that that would be a difficult conversation, but I can't imagine doing it without having those conversations. And reconciliation means to me having them and getting through them and understanding them so that we can move on. I don't have a question. I just have an observation.
That was an awesome comment, and we could partner together, Mrs. Gates.
Oh, I wish I had the money to do that.
I'm afraid this is another comment. Angie, you spoke most eloquently about the importance and the dignity of preserving your culture, your historic roots, your family's story. I feel exactly the same way, except my story and my culture, according to various members of this panel, is a little different. But it has the same urgency and the same sentimentality and nostalgia. And I want to honor my ancestors, and every time I see an important building coming down, I feel a loss.
I think that's a good comment. And what I did not mention is that my mother is not First Nations and my father is. They both grew up in Merritt. My mom's family was part of the Douglas Lake Cattle Syndicate. So my mom's family was buying up the land that was, taken from my dad's family. So I understand exactly what you're saying. I'm very proud of my family's connection to the ranching history in the Nicola Valley. But the point that I didn't say very well, I guess, is we have not created space for that other side of the story. And for me, it's about creating that space for that side of the story too. Not saying that the First Nations history of the Nicola Valley is more important than the rest of the history, but nobody's going to know what the First Nations history of the Nicola Valley is because there's no space for it.
And I just think your ancestors, their histories, and the urgency to propagate their histories has already happened. You are the center of society, and with being the center, you marginalize a lot of other identities, and I think it's time for that sense of urgency to be for us.
So, since a lot of folks are making comments instead of questions, I am so inclined as a person of color, as a settler with a complicated history of colonization, wanting to preserve buildings, monuments, etc. that are tied to the genocide, like actual genocide of people, is plain racist. No, like white heritage has no importance. This whole building, this whole town, all the buildings that were built by the British could come down and, like, I wouldn't care less. Like, other people couldn't care less, honestly. Like, a lot of trees came down, a lot of people died, a lot of people were killed. And some of y'all's ancestors did that. My ancestors killed my own ancestors, and that's fucked up. So, yeah, I think it would be good for some of you to reconsider what heritage means and whose heritage matters. It's really strange. Like, for me, heritage means, when I think of my heritage, I think of my culture, and it's really disconcerting. Like, looking around and seeing a lot of white folks here. I don't know what heritage you're wanting to preserve. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you. I'd just like to also point to something that the notion of how can we use, one of the questions that was posed up there was what's the use of heritage? And how can we perhaps use heritage against heritage itself? And that's sort of like maybe a comment on Robert's example in Hong Kong and Singapore, where, or Hong Kong PMQ and the Tai Kwun police stations, the two police stations that were converted into sort of art centers. There's a certain art washing that happens there, and in that sense, those two places have not actually addressed colonial violence. And how can we use the architecture that is the violent colonial architecture in Hong Kong itself, in that case, to address the violence that had taken place? Either like physically fracturing the architecture, so if you retain it but never retain it in its entirety as a whole, to show, maybe symbolically fracture it, show that it describes a certain violence to colonial architecture itself. That's all.
Is that a question or?
Well, the question might be, how can we use heritage against heritage?
What would you suggest would be the alternative in Hong Kong?
Some friends of mine and myself, some friends from the Hong Kong University of Architecture Department, as well as the Chinese University of Hong Kong Architecture Department, we're actually writing something about that. And, those two cases in Hong Kong, the PMQ, as well as the police merit man's headquarters, as well as the newly opened one, Tai Kwun, which is also in Central, and comparing it together with a couple of examples in Singapore itself, which also has that celebration that uses art washing to sort of efface colonial violence. the case of Singapore is the Gilman Barrack, so we're sort of working on a project about that right now. And it's centered around this notion of using heritage against heritage. So it's not, so in a case, it's not in the sense that it preserves the building without celebrating the glory of the British Empire.
That's what you think that building does?
The PMQ?
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly.
It wasn't my observation.
Okay, so I think we're running a little bit out of time. I want to end on a somewhat positive note, and I had a question, which I forgot to ask. And it's around sort of relationships. And I want to point this out because I think there's some enormity in this. Paul is part of Heritage BC. He's the executive director of Heritage BC, which is a heritage organization, obviously. Angie is Indigenous. She's on their board. I think it's quite admirable that Heritage BC has been able to get an Indigenous person on their board. And I just want to ask, how did you build that relationship, and how are you sustaining that relationship?
So the organization, Heritage BC, has been grappling with these issues for about 4 years, maybe longer. I've only been around for about 4 years. We felt we needed to change the conversation, in particular through our conference, which is one of our main vehicles each year. And we did initiate that change and started to bring in voices that have, like literally voices that have not been part of the conference in the past and part of this conversation about what is heritage. But we realized that we were somewhat disingenuous if we didn't embody it ourselves. So we went through a lot of work in trying to understand how do we become more of that organization that we're trying to tell other people to think about. One thing we did, we felt it very important. It's in our strategic plan because we wanted to make sure it was embedded into the organization, that we needed to have a diversity of voices on the board that will help guide the organization. And it partly leads, I think it might have been Angie who said, not about us, without us. And we believe that quite strongly, and we felt we have no right to be talking about Indigenous heritage without the input. We have colleagues, we've mentioned Karen a number of times, and I rely on Karen quite a lot, and Karen and I have a good relationship, and we talk about these issues back and forth. So Angie and I remember quite well our conversation. We have points of contact. There are people in common, but I had been appointed to call Angie and invite her to the board and explain why we were doing this. And I seem to remember, I don't know if my awkwardness came through the call. I felt very awkward because I feel awkward about these conversations. I just do. Because we so often invite people to boards, not-for-profits, invite people to boards because that's the right thing to do, and we're ticking a box. And I was so determined we were not going to do that in this case. She had very good questions about the organization, where were we going, why were we invited, and what her role would be. I'll let Andy talk more about that, but I will say, so it's been a little over a year and a half that we've formalized that relationship. And for me, it has been extraordinary. I rely on Angie. We never write anything that has that references Indigenous cultural heritage without it first being seen by Angie or Karen, that it has input, and we make sure we have got it as best we can. And I have learned just the slightest nuance of word can have a radical effect on what we mean. I may think I know what I mean, but then she might say, but if you just change that one word, I think that word is very powerful. So
from my side, it was interesting because for me, Heritage BC was always about built heritage, which is not the type of heritage that I've worked in and understand. And so when I was first presented with the opportunity, that was one of my first concerns is, so where are you going and how is it going to be, how am I going to be effective in an organization like this? How am I going to be able to bring my community's concerns forward? How am I going to be able to tap into the work that the Union of BC Indian Chiefs was doing? There are many players in the heritage field, and I think everybody's working at different levels on different initiatives. So I'm just lucky that I work at a place that's at one level, and I work in a community at an entirely different level. And I've worked with other communities at other levels. So I had the opportunity to see all of these places where the conversation around heritage was going. And what encouraged me most was the fact that Heritage BC was really looking internally at what they were doing and looking to expand that definition of heritage. And so I felt that the work that my community was doing could best be served by being a part of that conversation at a different level. And provincial level. Heritage BC has a far reach. They have networks that I didn't have a part of before, beyond my experience, and so I thought this is an opportunity to learn and give back. I didn't want to be a token person on the board. That quite often is a challenge with being an Indigenous person. You get invited to be on advisory committees because you're Indigenous, and sometimes it doesn't mean anything other than the fact that they've got you on their committee. So I didn't want that. That was not what I had time for. When you're an Indigenous person, I have a full-time job at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. I have a full-time job in my community, and I have volunteer time that I give to my community also. So you're constantly working. Time is precious. And so deciding to join the board, Heritage BC, wasn't something I took lightly, but I'm sure glad I did. I've really met some great people. There are Indigenous people who are associated with the organization who aren't on the board. So Kamala Todd has been a big part of one of the first conferences that I went to. And when I went to that and I seen those sessions, I knew I made the right decision.
I just want to, add to that. I'm the Debbie Downer of this panel, if you haven't noticed. I think it's troublesome that in the whole history of Heritage BC, that we're supposed to rejoice or be thankful for just a year and a half for there to be Indigenous representation on the board. That shouldn't get a clap, that should get more questions.
I'll say no one's asking for a clap. For us, it is a big change, and I think it is. As I said, I haven't been associated all that long. The conversation around heritage is evolving quite a lot, which is where we started, and this is part of it. And I'm learning. We've heard Angie is learning, and it's a very, very, the way I see it, it's a very long journey, and we have a very long way to go to understand the complexity of what this is and how to make it work. As I said earlier, this is an evolution that we're in. We're going through a passage that is difficult at this time. But what I can say is we are trying. And we're not trying to do the tokenism, which I've had lots and lots of boards in my time, and they've all tried the tokenism approach, or many of them have tried that. We are trying. We've hired Indigenous people to do programming. We are working on these things, and it has to start somewhere, and it has to start with the first step. And we're in the first step.
I think it's hard. It's going to be a long journey because I don't know if we as a global society has unlearned European imperialism and colonialism.
one thing I didn't mention, the thing I like about it is I get two opportunities. I get asked, why is your heritage more important than my heritage? I get asked that at every conference. I get pulled aside and people want to talk about that. And I love to be able to talk about that because it gives me the opportunity to share why things are important to me. And the other question I get a lot more frequently these days is, how do we do engagement? I really want to work with our local communities. How do I do it? And they may have tried some things that didn't work. And I'm all about helping open those doors. So I think it's an opportunity.
Thank you, Robert, Anisha, Paul, Angie. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I hope we heard some things that made us think about different things, and that's helped a bit. We're back on November 28th, and we're specifically talking about heritage and what might happen to it with citywide planning. So please join us. Thank you.